know that climate change is creating risks in the real world and potentially unpriced risks in financial markets. There are now more and more ways to manage carbon risk while maintaining desired investment characteristics, and many are looking to financial markets to facilitate a more resilient and sustainable economy. With this in mind, institutional investors, including the Government Pension Investment Fund, or GPIF, in Japan, are increasingly integrating elements of E, S, and G into their strategies. Hello, I'm Hannah Skeets, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Andrew Innes and Neil McIndoe to talk about the drivers for increasing interest in carbon-efficient investing specifically, and S&P DJI's Carbon Efficient Index Series. Thanks very much for joining me. Neil, we've seen an increasing desire by institutional investors to understand, measure, and manage the environmental impacts in their portfolios and investments. What's driving this and why now?
Well, yes, it's true. I think the environmental performance of companies has become much more of a mainstream concern. And the main driver for this is climate change and the need to reduce carbon emissions. If you look at the Paris Agreement in 2015, over 190 countries signed up to reduction targets. And if those reduction targets are going to be met, then it is almost certain that the price of carbon will have to rise. And indeed, if you look at the EU ETS price of carbon today, it's currently at 25 euros a tonne, and that is a 5-fold increase over what it was in May last year. And so with that cost implication, companies are being encouraged to report on these matters. So we've seen the G20 come up with a task force which produced guidance on this. In Japan, the Stewardship Code was revised last year to encourage companies to proactively look at environmental matters. And in France, the Energy and Transition Law requires not only companies to report, but also asset owners and investment managers. So given all these developments, and it's in fact not surprising that the more thoughtful investors are starting to look at carbon performance as part of their investment process.
That's great. And Andrew, when you're thinking about creating a carbon efficient index, from a design perspective, what were the kind of key elements that you had to keep in mind?
So really there's two critical points. One is obviously to reduce the carbon intensity of the index or the portfolio. But second to that, a key objective is to maintain a similar characteristic to the benchmark. So that means to have an index which has a low tracking error to that of the benchmark. And the two objectives are kind of in conflict with one another. So it's relatively easy to reduce carbon intensity of a portfolio. You just reduce the weights of those companies which have the highest carbon emissions to revenue intensities. But to balance that with keeping a low tracking error, what we adopted was a industry group neutral weighting approach. So that means we maintain the industry group weights from the benchmark, and that prevents industries like energy, utilities and materials from having a very low underweight active bet in the carbon efficient strategy. And those are the two key objectives.
So if those are the main objectives, were there any secondary or other types of considerations that you built in when you were designing the index?
Yeah, so for any individual company, there are a few elements that help determine what weight that company should have in the index. First of all would be to see what industry group the company is within. So we define an industry group as either high, mid or low impact. And the reason we do that is because certain industries like banks and utilities are considered low impact, and therefore they have very low range in carbon emissions. So it doesn't make much sense, and there's not much justification for reducing or tilting the weights too far away from the benchmark weights, because ultimately you'll probably just increase the tracking error and not have much benefits in terms of carbon intensity reduction. So we reserve the highest weight adjustments for those at mid and even more so for high impact industry groups. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we look at companies on a global scale. So we've created the S&P Carbon Global Standards classification system. So rather than compare companies to how they fit within the local peer group, we look at the global peer group, and we use the S&P Global Large Mid Cap Index to do that. And then where it sits in a relative ranking into deciles, we decide how much additional weight should be added or taken away. And there's one final element which is about disclosure as well. We have the data from Trucost, which tells us whether a company is deemed to have sufficiently disclosed its carbon data, and therefore we can use that in the weighting scheme itself. So we add a slight increase in weight adjustment for those companies that are noted to have disclosed their carbon data.
Thanks. And that's interesting on the topic of disclosure, because it's actually becoming central to the discussion. Neil, maybe you can tell us a bit more about the true cost carbon data that was used in this index.
Yes, certainly. Well, I mean, things like the G20 guidance and indeed regulation and the investment pressure that Andrew has just mentioned are definitely improving disclosure. But there are a number of things that true cost do which really enable these indices. The first of these is our coverage, which is very extensive. We cover 15,000 companies, and that includes the topics index of nearly 2,300 Japanese companies. And we also have historic data going back 10 years in many jurisdictions. That's incredibly useful for trend analysis or for back testing investment theses. And then secondly, where there are gaps, we have built really granular, detailed environmental profiles for each business activity, and that gives us an estimate of what emissions would be in the absence of reporting. And that's useful, obviously, to complete data sets, but it's also a very good sense check for the information that companies themselves give us, because companies do make mistakes. And then thirdly, we engage with every company that we cover. So we send a very detailed report of their carbon emissions, the sources of data to the companies, and we encourage them to give us further information. And as part of that process, roughly a third of companies will respond to us. So in the end, we end up with a carbon data set which has very robust quality control over it. It is standardized and it is complete. And indeed, it's been used by many investment firms, many investment companies for well over a decade.
So Andrew, just to finish up, maybe you could highlight for us the key points about the carbon efficient index. What are its main characteristics?
Okay, so I mean the strategy is applicable to many of our benchmark indices and our regional indices, but in general, by and large, what we see are very close return series on the backtest to that of the benchmark. So that by that I mean very low tracking error. In some cases there may be some outperformance as well, but I guess ultimately some people may believe that the outperformance may become a reality in the future when carbon pricing may or may not get priced in. So we have very low tracking error, and at that very little expense we have significant carbon intensity reduction. So for instance, for the largest global large mid-cap index, we see over the past 9 years about 60 bips tracking error annually. So yeah, it's a very low tracking error and very significant carbon intensity reduction of typically in the range of 30 to 40%, depending on the index and the region.
Thanks. And it's great to see GPIF showing global industry leadership in managing carbon and in adopting this index. Thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you.
To learn more about the S&P Global Carbon Efficient Indices and to read related research, please visit spdji.com.